Leadership with worship as its center. Leaders and worshipping communities. The first commandment shows a better way. The first guidelines that I would propose is that leaders need, as James K. Smith suggests, to place themselves in liturgical and formative practices that restore our creational desire for God and turns our heart and ultimate devotion towards Him. This will also renew the leader's mind so that she or he is more capable of moral discernment. It follows that all leaders should be part of a community of authentic worship. Liturgical leadership in the church. A worshiping community or a church can model what I will call liturgical leadership, despite the fact that idolatry also appears in churches. Exactly how churches worships will depend on their tradition. All Christians and all Christian traditions will nevertheless agree that worship is an end in itself. The church worships because of who God is. As the church receives His love, it is transformed into His image and begins loving the self-giving way that He loves. This implies that the church, secondly, will engage in implicit worship through good works that builds moral communities within the church itself, but also in the world. Liturgical leadership, in this sense, can be seen as a communitarian model of servant leadership that offers a robust paradigm of human flourishing and what it means to empower others. It's crucial to acknowledge that the church also must model how worship may be a part of and integrate the other dimensions of leadership. Prayer can, for instance, integrate different methods and stages of strategic leadership into a whole. The biblical story may also play an important role as a tool of contextual analysis and strategic envisioning of the organization's future. Finally, I would suggest that liturgical practices also should integrate how the organization implements change. This should, however, not be understood as an instrumentalist use of spiritual resources. Liturgical practices rather expresses an ultimate trust and reliance upon God. On the implications of monotheism for organizational leadership. Before I move on to discuss how liturgical leadership may be performed in the pluralistic world of late modern organizations, I will turn to a more fundamental question. Social scientists since Max Weber has long seen Exodus as the birth of the line organization. The logic of relevation and leadership in the name of God creates a line with at least three layers: God, the one who leads in His name, and the receiving people. Zygmunt Bauman highlights the epistemological implication of this form of monotheism. Because there is one God, there is one truth, and one overarching purpose. For this reason, he is critical to monotheistic communities, fearing that these will gravitate towards the kind of monolithic cultures that Turich and Wache identified in the Enron case. This is obviously a danger that applies to all organizations that follows the logic of monotheism. I will nevertheless suggest that these social scientific images of the monotheistic organizations should be theologically modified. Firstly, as I have suggested above, the giving of the law also includes the egalitarian ethos of equal regard, or loving one's neighbor as oneself, and a constitutional structure that makes leaders accountable. This also meant that kings could be confronted by prophets. Power is even more radically distributed in the New Testament church, where Miroslav Volf identifies a polycentric participative structure in the image of the interplay in the Trinity. In the charismatic church, all members are both givers and receivers of God's gifts, although some lead more than others. This implies that Trinitarian monotheism also includes democratic, or what the church calls synodic practices, where truth is interpreted and discussed. McKibben and Williams goes as far as suggesting that in Orthodox theology one cannot speak about hierarchy without also speaking about conciliarity. Exactly how these structures will be combined will, however, vary in different Christian traditions. Secondly, the New Testament also presents models of leadership which dramatically contradicts the kind of leadership that is portrayed by Turich and Wache. Jesus is portrayed as the anointed one and as the coming king who is the judge of nations. Yet, at the same time, he is the suffering, self-sacrificing servant at the cross, who doesn't coerce but invites people to follow him through practices of hospitality and forgiveness. A number of scholars have observed that he instructs his disciples not to rule over his followers, but to be leading servants who serve like him. In a similar way, Paul leads mainly by persuasion and empowerment. In Pauline theology, the 10 words are transformed from law to spirit, in the sense that followers now primarily are driven by love as a volitional response to God's grace. A proper theological model of charismatic leadership is therefore not cult-like, but is based on egalitarian values and empower followers through a combination of hierarchical and synodic practices. Liturgical leadership in faith-based organizations. Monotheism also implies that the world belongs to God and his people is part of his sending to the world. Leaders who are shaped by the first commandment will therefore also seek to perform liturgical leadership in the world. Exactly how this can be done will chiefly depend on two contextual variables. A, the mission, vision and core values that directs the organizational culture in which they serve, and B, the worldview and ethics of their co-workers and customers or partners. Faith-based organizations that operate in the market or in the public sphere may be seen as an extension of the worshipping community. In such organizations, leaders may still facilitate devotional practices and seek to model and promote relational ethics that reflects the paradigm of the 10 words. This is important since communities that don't explicitly worship by definitions become secular. Research shows that devotional practices can be influential in terms of building a vibrant and ethical organizational culture in faith-based organizations that operate in the marketplace or in the public sphere. Yet, this enterprise is a risky business that needs careful consideration for at least two reasons. Firstly, leaders must protect such devotional practices from abuse. They must be performed as ends and not as means of manipulating followers to perform. Secondly, leaders must also protect the religious freedom of co-workers that don't share their religious worldview. The hospitable nature of Christian leadership implies that leaders in faith-based organizations should allow critical reflection and facilitate worship in a way that makes participation in devotional practices authentically volitional. Liturgical leadership in secular organizations. However, in the late modern context, most leaders will be located in secular organizational cultures that don't share the theological vision of the first commandment. Leaders who are committed to the 10 words are therefore like Jews in their exile in Babylon, in, but not of, an organizational culture that they nonetheless have to build. The most obvious contribution that such leaders can make is to be moral examples in interpersonal relations. By modeling a life after the paradigm of the 10 words, they may also honor God indirectly and bear witness to the first commandment. If they lead at the visionary level, they may also promote the basic moral paradigm of the 10 words in the strategic process, even though they sometimes have to use non-theological or implicit theological language. In this way, they may create fragmented visionary images of the good life, which, despite being compromises, or what I have called broken hallelujahs, nevertheless can contribute to the common effort of building good organizations and moral communities. The Judeo-Christian leader will nevertheless also face many dilemmas that call for the kind of critical theological reflection that I have outlined in this presentation. Following Don Carson, I will suggest that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for how Judeo-Christian leaders should relate to cultures, in this case, organizational cultures. Leaders will always try to transform the cultures in which they live. They will seek to lead by example, by visionary persuasion, by caring for individuals. This may also include different forms of confrontations by means of intellectual discernment or other forms of resistance to idolatry. In most cases, Christian leaders will nevertheless live in a paradoxical tension between Christ and culture, while they are attempting to transform it. However, in certain situations, they might also choose to leave a given organization because the idolatrous orientation is too strong and is likely to make severe damage to those involved. Conclusion and questions for discernment. What I've tried to do in this presentation is to offer some tools for theological discernment based on the first commandment. These may be summarized in 5 key questions that can be used in all types of organizations. 1. Are we creating quasi-religious or unethical images of the good life? Leaders should not promote visions of life that to a significant degree contradicts the moral paradigm of the 10 words. It follows that they should not promote brands or organizational visions as totalizing images of the good life, but rather present such visions as what they are, partial or fragmented visions. 2. Do we directly or indirectly demand that people see the organization as an ultimate concern? The enterprise of building culture includes rituals that create enthusiasm around common values, but leaders should resist cult-like leadership, organizational rituals, and forms of organizing and evaluation that indirectly tells the followers that the organization should be their ultimate concern. 3. Are we becoming local idols that allows ourselves to rise above ethical standards and procedures and see others or the organization as servants for our wants? This calls for a form of critical self-evaluation that needs to be undertaken with mentors or leaders or co-workers. Are we getting high on our power or on the admiration of others? Do we have a perfectionist self-image that is hostile to critique? Do we have a false sense of ownership that allows us making decisions that violate the 10 words and the constitution of the organization? And finally, do we see others as natural servants for us so that we may use them to satisfy our egocentric needs? 4. Are we so taken by the pursuit of success that we have lost sight of higher moral values? The question does not concern whether organization has values in charters or in its self-presentation. The question is, are these values really guiding our conduct? Is there still a tension between moral concerns and the desire to win at all costs? Is it possible to argue against pragmatic solutions with models of justice, or is the higher purpose of success always prevailing? Do we see our co-workers simply as means that can be sacrificed for our ends, or do we treat them as people that we will serve? Do we produce co-workers with a relative holistic life vision, or are they getting into performance addiction? 5. Do we place ourselves in proper liturgical practices that turn our love towards God and shapes us in His image as serving transformational leaders? James K. Smith tells us correctly that knowledge and bright ethical thinking is not enough. We need to place ourselves in practices that shape our hearts and desire towards God. Leaders should therefore plant themselves in a community that worships and shows how different dimensions of leadership may be integrated by authentic spirituality. Such practices are the hope of the world because they may create transforming leaders whose service is shaped in the image of the Trinity and whose life becomes a fulfillment of the 10 Commandments.